Hi folks, welcome back to American Literature. Today we're going to be studying one of my favorite authors and my absolute favorite story by her. Our author today is Miss Eudora Welty. In fact, here she is. This is a picture of Miss Eudora. Born in Jackson, Mississippi in 1909, she lived and wrote for most of her life in Mississippi. She attended the Mississippi University for Women in Columbus, Mississippi. In fact, if you visit there today, her portrait still hangs on the wall of the administration building. She is one of their most honored graduates. It's in the administration building, in fact, bears her name. Every year they have a Eudora Welty Writers Symposium. And she graduated from the University of Wisconsin in 1929. She was studying advertising at Columbia when her father took ill and died, and so she returned to Mississippi. She took a job as a radio writer and a society columnist. Later, she took a job with the Depression-era Works Progress Administration, taking amazing photographs of America at that time and interviewing people. She started writing fiction in 1931, publishing in the Southern Lit Review. Her first collection of stories, A Curtain of Green, was published in 1941, and a second collection followed in 1942, The Wide Net. Her first novel, The Robber Bridegroom, followed soon after. In 1942, she won the O. Henry National Prize for short fiction. You can visit her home in Jackson, Mississippi, and see the desk where she wrote her stories. Miss Eudora Welty, in fact, passed away back in 2001, and she was a national treasure. Now, the great thing about this story, I love this story so much because if you grew up in the South, you know these ladies, right? If you ever took your grandmother to the beauty shop or ever went there with your mom, you know exactly what is going on in this story. You have probably seen this kind of thing unfold. Now, on the surface, it seems like a simple little story about a couple of ladies at a beauty shop, but it is so much more than that. There's a lot going on here. This is a story about power and relationships. This is a story about control and so much more. It is a fascinating tale, and in this little southern beauty shop is a microcosm of society. It seems fairly simple on the surface, like I said, but in this story you have a member of society losing status to an interloper and then regaining it. You have an interloper disturbing the relationship in the stable society who must be ultimately expelled from that society to restore the balance. The thing that makes this story so great, it's number one, it's funny. Number two, these people are so real. I like to think that she was probably sitting around the beauty shop one day and just observing the goings on there, and this came into her. This story made it just sort of fell into her lap. It is the second most it is her most anthologized story. The second most is Why I Live the P.O., which is a story about family dynamics, and it's absolutely hilarious. But I remember the first time I taught this story, I got my anthology. I was going to teach a world literature at the University of Southern Mississippi. Excuse me. And the faculty who had compiled the anthology included Mississippi stories in it, as a matter of course. And I remember sitting in the subway and reading this and just crying. I was laughing so hard about at the things that go on, because it's just so vivid. There are a couple of ladies sitting over at another table. What are you reading? I said, Eudora Welty. It's hilarious. Anyway, so in any small town in the South, the place you learn about news, sports, and weather is your local beauty shop, or if you're a guy, in the barber shop. This is a place where women can get together without the influence of men. Right. Notice there are no men in the story, and pardon my notes there, flip pages there. No men in the story, not at all. In fact, what we have here instead, we have the only male character in the story is Miss Pike's little boy, who's just kind of wandering around the place. Right. He's this mischievous little bratty kid who Leota puts up with. Anyway. A lot of beauty shops were set up in enclosed garages or enclosed porches and so forth. Sometimes there's a parlor with multiple chairs. So, like I said, you grew up in the South, you know this image very well. And so, this is the kind of setting that you want to think of when you're reading this story. Things to look for in this story: there is gossip, there are power struggles, status, control, freaks, and gender roles. All these play a very vital part to this story. Now, the story opens with Leota, the beautician, working on Mrs. Fletcher. Leota is kind of the power player here, right? She's the information broker. She's working on Miss Fletcher, who is kind of a Karen, really. Miss Fletcher takes notice of the roast peanuts that Leota has in her purse, and at this point we're introduced to Mrs. Pike, who never quite makes an appearance in the beauty shop. She's all just she's completely off stage. She's talked about, but never makes an actual appearance. So Mrs. Fletcher is immediately curious, right? Because she sees Mrs. Pike as a threat to her status, especially in her friendship with Leota here. Okay, what we know about Mrs. Pike: she's from New Orleans. She is superstitious. She's fascinating because she's new in town, right? And like a lot of small southern towns, things don't really change so much, right? They remain the same. You live and work with the same people over and over again, and everybody knows everybody's business. So somebody like Mrs. Pike is going to introduce a new interesting dynamic to this world, right? Because she's exotic in a way. She's from New Orleans, and that's a place kind of far away from Jackson, Mississippi. We also know Leota is a bit contentious when it comes to her friendships. Mr. and Mrs. Pike came to rent from Leota and her husband after they kicked out their previous renters, right? You can just feel the seething jealousy when Leota finishes telling her about Mrs. Pike, right? She's, Leota even drops the information. She says, well, Mrs. Pike is a friend. Distinguishing between friend and client, which must have really gotten, it's a little subtle thing, but really got under Mrs. Fletcher's skin here. And so Mrs. Fletcher says, well, she must be cute. This kind of drops it out there. Leota lays it on even thicker by by bragging on Mrs. Pike. She twists the knife a little bit more by telling Mrs. Fletcher that her hair is falling out. So your hair is falling out. What are you doing? Right? Mrs. Fletcher tries to gain some power over by blaming Leota for burning her hair and the perm. This was the thing too, like perms, it's essentially it's a chemical. Well, you ladies know what I'm talking about, or maybe you don't. Maybe we've gotten past that. It's essentially a chemical treatment, and if you leave it in too much, it can actually burn the scalp and burn the hair too. Leota definitely counters her and further states that Mrs. Fletcher is pregnant. It suggests that Mrs. Fletcher is pregnant. See, key information. Mrs. Leota, is an observer here. She is a power mover, information broker. And now notice the fact she's evasive about it and how she found out that Mrs. Fletcher is pregnant. How did you know? She gets Mrs. Fletcher upset to the point that she makes an impotent threat against whomever told her that she was pregnant. The whole story where Leota suggests who told people she was pregnant turns out to be incorrect, actually. Yeah. Leota lets her work herself up, and then turns as if she didn't know for a fact that Mrs. Fletcher. Then the thing is, she didn't know for a fact that Mrs. Fletcher was pregnant until Mrs. Fletcher outed herself. Yeah. At this point, she lets on that Mrs. Pike figured it out. Again, the villainous Mrs. Pike, who never makes a full appearance on the screen, but is talked about. Right? From here forward, Mrs. Fletcher has a reason to make Mrs. Pike her enemy. Oh, well, that gossip she's been telling people that I'm pregnant. She just know Leota work. I mean, Leota has allowed Mrs. Fletcher to work herself up. Meanwhile, Leota amps up her praise of Mrs. Pike, right? She says, remember, she is referred to her as a friend, not a client. Yeah. She goes into detail about their trip to the freak show. And let's take a look here. Freak show. But there we go. It's the freak show. Right? Many years ago, in less enlightened times, when entertainment was not what it was, you'd have these, what it is today, and certainly not as politically correct. You would have these shows of carnivals where you would have human oddities, people with deformities, right? And one of these characters, one of these oddities in our story is the titular character, the Petrified Man. Okay. So, she goes into detail, though, about their trip to the freak show and answers Mrs. Fletcher's every question about Mrs. Pike. Notice how Mrs. Fletcher's every question is about Mrs. Pike. Doesn't really care so much about the freak show. She's just trying to get information, because information is power, right? And let's be honest, Leota knows exactly what she's doing. She's given Mrs. Fletcher enough rope to hang herself. She's information gathering because among other things, she feels threatened by Mrs. Pike, right? Leota turns the screws when she tells her, the Miss Fletcher, that she's going to hire her as a beautician in the shop. She tries to change the subject, asking her how Mr. and Mrs. Pike met and then replying that she met Mr. Pike at a rental library. Mrs. Fletcher's final parting shot is when she says Mrs. Pike probably needs a facial. Yeah. This sort of impotent but passive-aggressive little stab. Oh, she probably just needs a facial. In about the space of a week, though, the whole thing turns around. Everything kind of falls apart. Yeah. And it's Mrs. Fletcher is back in her place in the pecking order. Mrs. Pike is on the outs. Now, the paradigm shifted, right? Leota is saying a lot of negative stuff about Mrs. Pike, who was just a week before was her best friend, right? Her exotic, interesting, unique woman friend from New Orleans. The very things that she was praising for about, now she's criticizing. The sharp, smart-eyed Mrs. Pike became the villain. She recognizes the Petrified Man in the freak show and recognizes him in a crime detective pulp magazine. If you've been, they used to have these magazines in the magazine racks at convenience stores, things like True Crime, True Detective, that sort of thing. And being a beauty shop, she'd have a lot of these magazines laying around, and she took some of these and put them in the apartment that Mr. and Mrs. Pike were renting. And so Mrs. Pike they're all gathered there for one evening. Mrs. Pike is looking through the True Crime magazine and recognizes the Petrified Man from the freak show. And so they figured out he's wanted for raping 4 women. This is not funny by itself, but in context as a Southern Gothic type story, it's played a bit for humor. It's dark humor, but humor just the same. So what does Miss Pike do but goes and turns him in? Yeah. Notice what happens on page 53. Now, the two of them start taking Miss Pike down a peg or two in their conversation. Miss Fletcher mostly starts by boasting about her sensitivity, saying she'd have sensed that there was something off about the Petrified Man if it were her. No, if I'd been there, I would have known, right? Here Leota starts in about that she did feel something, essentially reinforcing the assertion that Mrs. Pike cheated her out of the $500 reward. Now think about that too. She turned him in for this $500 reward, and that should have been half mine because it was my magazine. No. Sorry, not really. But anyway, the story ends with Leota turning on Mrs. Pike's son Billy and punishing him for for the very thing he was doing that she found cute at the beginning of the story, right? He's just being a kid. He's a little bit of a brat, but he's just being a kid, right? And so ultimately the two of them collude to punish Mrs. Pike by proxy in spanking little Charlie. Now think about that for a minute. Think about the way that men are portrayed in the story. The titular character is a freak show attraction. He is supposedly only able to move a quarter or so because a quarter inch or so because of the medical condition that's supposedly turning him into stone. There's an actual medical condition, by the way, where your joints become more or less solidified. You can't move. That's not really the case with this guy, though. He is a performer. He's hiding out in plain sight. This being a beauty shop, though, the women are more free in their talk about their husbands and men in general. All right. Mrs. Fletcher, for instance, says, Mr. Fletcher can't do a thing with me. Right? Later she talks about how she calls her husband Shrimp because she's taller than he is, but later says how much in love they are. Mrs. Montjoy, Leota says that Mrs. Montjoy's husband can't do a thing with her because, based on the fact that he couldn't stop her from coming to the beauty shop when she was in labor. Okay. And this, too, I believe, is a very Southern thing. Sorry, my cat is trying to get my attention here. Is a very Southern thing. Old girlfriend of mine, when her mother gave birth to her, she wouldn't let them bring the baby until she'd done her makeup, and she wanted her daughter to see her all done up the first time that they met. Same thing with Mrs. Montjoy. She was, look, I know I'm in labor, but I'm going to have my hair done before. I'm not going to have those folks in that delivery room see me in less than my best. Right? Oh, gracious. And Leota says if she listens to Fred, they'd be floating down the Yazoo River. Said she was sick of her husband, Fred, and about to send him to Vicksburg, even though he didn't want to go. And also, let's see, Mrs. Pike here. Even Mrs. Pike is not immune. Or Mr. Pike, rather, is not immune. He doesn't want to turn the Petrified Man in. He lays into them for not working and she lays into Mr. Pike for not working and being lazy. Also remember, too, Mrs. Fletcher says, talks about how if her husband does something that she doesn't like, she winds up getting one of her sick headaches. Yeah. So these men aren't there to defend themselves, right? They're not there. They never make an appearance. The only male is Billy. So you have this space here where they are safe to be themselves and to say what they really think about men. This is their sort of power structure, their place where they are the rulers of the roost. Now, ultimately, they take out their frustrations on poor old Charlie, the only male actually present in the story who is too small to defend himself. Right? In a way, by them getting together and spanking Charlie, they're restoring their relationship. Charlie becomes a proxy for Mrs. Pike, who they are both put out with, but can't do anything to because, number one, she's not there, and number two, could probably handle herself. It could be that Charlie is also a proxy for the men in their lives that frustrate them, that they feel powerless to do anything about. But here's Charlie, and Charlie is small. Yeah. But ultimately, he triumphs in the end, kicking Leota and Mrs. Fletcher in the shins, telling them, if you're so smart, why aren't you rich? He's right. He calls both of them out on their whole superficial society there. So, anyway, delightful story. It always never fails to crack me up because it is so real. And, like I said, you know these ladies. You've seen this world. If you've grown up in the South, you know these are the ladies that pinch your cheek or swat your legs in church when you're getting out of line or say, oh, aren't you just the cutest little thing? Right? This is a typical Southern story. Could only take place in the South, in a world that Eudora Welty knew, and that's what makes this a fantastic tale. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. At the very least, I hope you got a chuckle out of it. All right, that's it for now. We will see you in the next video.